Welcome to Mondays with Mike, Game Changers in Lacrosse, where we cover topics related to lacrosse, education, and youth development.
Hello, welcome back to Monday with Mike. Very excited for this conversation. We're joined today by two great friends and two of the smartest people I know in the world of youth sports and sports-based youth development. Megan Bartlett, who is the founder and executive director. Is that the correct title?
No, I don't do that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You're just the brains of the operation. Is that your title?
I'm just the like totally impractical ideas person.
Okay. Big idea person at Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport, which I hear referenced as the center a lot. So I've adopted that. But we'll get into a little bit about what you all are doing there, what led you to that in a minute, and by Jenny Moe, who is our Chief Program Officer at Harlem Lacrosse and is one of many people who's had just about every job you can have at Harlem Lacrosse in the course of her tenure here and helped many kids and the organization along the way. Um, so Megan, just want to hear a little bit for our audience who may not be as familiar with the center, just a little bit about your background. And I, of course, know you from way back in the day when we used to share an office. But would love for you to share a little bit about your journey in this universe and how it led you to do what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. You weren't there 20 years ago, Mike, but I was. It was this fall 20 years ago that I started working at America Scores. I was working in the Boston office. Scores is a soccer creative writing and service learning program. And I was working across Boston in school-based after-school soccer programs. I had been a soccer player and coach, and I think, didn't fully recognize that sport was not something that was equally available to all young people until I went to work at Scores. And so I started to understand that just like all kinds of resources for kids in communities that have been, intentionally divested from, sport is not a given. And the ability to offer that opportunity, the ability to offer sport programs that help kids feel like they belong, that help kids move their bodies, that help them help support their mental health, that just became like, that was the light bulbs all went off when I had that job. It sort of felt like using something I loved to do something good. And so I worked there. I then worked for an organization called Up to Us, where we started a national service program for coaching, which was wonderful because it meant I got to spend a lot of time with a lot of coaches. And then about 8 years ago, we started the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport. And we focus on getting the adults in young people's lives the tools that they need to sort of leverage the inherent and often underutilized power of sport to support young people. So here I am.
Can you talk a little bit about the work that you do there? Like what's kind of sort of a typical engagement with an organization or what kinds of partners do you work with?
Yeah. Our work, I think, falls into three buckets. The thing we've sort of are maybe known best for and have been doing the longest is just sort of training with directly to adults who are working with young people, making sure that they understand how to use their sport experience more intentionally to support young people. Most coaches that are working with young people don't have background in youth development or human development or sort of an understanding of sometimes what's developmentally appropriate for young people, young kids of different ages. Most coaches coach the way they were coached, and often that's okay. It's just one way of coaching. And most of the time, they've got kids who need different ways of coaching in addition to that. So we try to equip coaches with more skills to do that. We also work directly with programs. to build their capacity to support coaches. So that looks like some program design, some evaluation work. It can look like training the sort of leadership of an organization to understand some of the research in positive youth development and in sort of trauma-informed care so that they can create better environments for young people. And then the last thing that we've been doing a lot more of in the last 3 or 4 years is we started to understand that no matter how many people we were able to reach, how many people were able to train, real change wasn't going to happen unless we were able to make some sort of impact on the system. The youth sports system is so broken. And I say youth sports system, and there really isn't even a youth sports system because it's so siloed. It's so, there's such a lack of accountability in the youth sports space that we're, training coaches can absolutely change the experience for individual young people, but we're not going to sort of turn the tide on really delivering on the promise of sport unless we make a system play. And so we do a couple of things at a collective action level. We run something called the Coalitions for Sport Equity, which gets leaders from different city-based collaboratives together to share their learnings, to figure out ways to activate larger networks of sport programs. We run a funders collaborative to organize some of the funders in the space to think about shared impact, and if doing their work together might actually unlock more opportunity than they're able to do by themselves. And we just, as sort of an offshoot of the funders collaborative, we just launched something called the Move Fund, which is a pooled fund seeded by Nike, but something that we have, I think, six or 8 members of the steering committee, funding organizations that are putting their money together to fund some of the least glamorous stuff in the space, some of that collective action work. So we granted about $1.1 million in to city-based collaboratives in October. So
Well,
yeah,
very cool. It's super helpful, and I think it is informs a lot of the discussion that I like to have because I really view you as an expert practitioner, someone who is very close to people who are working with kids on the ground and someone who's worked with kids on the ground, but also someone who's connected to and an expert in really the research and the science that informs that that practice, and also someone who really understands the landscape almost better than anyone else, knowing what organizations are doing what. There's some really cool stuff happening, I think, in the city-based collaboratives. As an organization, we're a little bit unique in that we're in 5 cities. So some of our cities are in places where there's really healthy collaboratives. Some of our regions are places where that's trying to evolve. But you're seeing, I think, what I'm seeing is those collaboratives are really starting to see how they can add unique value to the space. And it's very cool to be a part of because I think it's taken some time to say, okay, so many of these organizations are very grassroots.
yep.
That's another way that Harlem Lacrosse is sometimes a little bit in between, is we are, slightly less grassroots than the average sports-based youth development organization, but not yet to the scale of, a much larger organization. So
Totally.
we usually have a budget that is larger than the city collaboratives, but we are finding really great ways to work together. So that's very cool. And I'd love, Jenny, for you to share a little bit about kind of your position, your charge as Chief Program Officer at Harlem Lacrosse, and your background, kind of how you found yourself in that position.
So my charge as Chief Program Officer is to make sure that our programs in our 5 cities are as consistent and effective as possible. And so a lot of time is spent with the managers in our regions to make sure that we are clear on what is our program model and what are our priorities for this year, and then working with them to make sure that each individual program is executing that to the best of their ability and that they have the resources and the training to do so. We spend a lot of time in data. We like to say that data tells a story, certainly not the whole story, but I'm a really firm believer that kids vote with their feet. And so if they're showing up to something, then it's working. And if they're not, then we need to adjust. So we have a lot of tools to make sure that we're having data-informed conversations when we're talking about the effectiveness of our model. How I got here, I started at Harlem Lacrosse as a program director in Baltimore, and then was our executive director, and then shifted into this role. I definitely leaned over the years towards the program side of our work, and loved being part of innovating our model, and just enjoy doing that work consistently now with all 5 of our regions.
Well, so Megan, I'm kind of curious. We're going to get into some of the things that Jenny and her team have developed and the way
Yeah.
they're being used at Harlem Lacrosse, because I think you have a really valuable perspective on that work. But I'm curious, just like you see every SBYD org that exists, from your perspective, kind of like what is unique about Harlem Lacrosse?
There are a lot of things that are unique about Harlem Lacrosse. And I think Jenny just summarized really well one of them. I think the field is still not as data driven as it can and should be. And there are very real constraints on the field to be able to do that. One of those is resources. And it takes a lot of sort of input to be as thoughtful about data as you all are. And the other is that I think sort of youth serving spaces aren't great at this anywhere. So there aren't a lot of really good models for how to do this. And so I think you all are unique in that, and you are creating a model to be replicated in that way, right? Like the field, there are not great tools to use to be data driven. So I think what we're going to talk about is the fact that Jenny has had to make up a lot of these tools, right? Like all of this isn't something that you can just sort of download and plug and play. You have to be really thoughtful about it. You have to be really intentional about it. And for the most part, you have to build them yourselves. There are a handful of organizations that I think are as well established as you all, as thoughtful about it as you are, but they're few and far between. And so there's things to learn from them, but also huge opportunities to pass along that learning to the organizations that don't have the same kind of resources.
I had a conversation with a funder recently, and I said, "Look, you gave us general operating expense, and they're very into the data story that we tell and the way that we're using data." I said, "Here's a couple ways that we've deployed those resources that I would not have known to ask for when I wrote the grant." And this is a person, her name's Mary, and she really like ensures that there's integrity to this data and that the systems that collect the data are maintained well, and puts our program team, which includes Jenny and one of her associates, Claudia, who's also a great employee in this regard, puts them in a position to analyze the data and then make it actionable.
Yeah.
And so, like, by you giving us general operating expense, you helped us strengthen the data infrastructure. You should feel really good about that, you know? And I think we didn't know what to ask for, you know, and we're still in that position as we build it out. But I think it's one of the ways that unrestricted funding can really drive this part of your organization forward. And one of the things that I've learned is, you know, it's one thing to say, okay, we want data to make a chart that goes up and to the right so we can tell our funders that we're effective and we can get money.
Yep.
But it's another thing to use data to inform your practice to make you more effective. And they're not oppositional for sure, but to do the latter requires lots of things. It's, you know, a data infrastructure. Where are you technically going to store this information and how is it going to be used? It requires a management infrastructure. Okay, great. You have the information. Who's looking at it? And who's making decisions about what happens next? And then how are your direct service staff managed such that this makes its way into their day-to-day? And I think and then there's sort of like the analytic muscle, like who actually does the analysis, who is capable of looking at all these different inputs and then drawing out conclusions that are useful to your organization.
Yep.
Those are all components of what it means for us, what it means to use data. And I think it is a commitment. It's definitely part of what we want to distinguish Harlem Lacrosse is like depth over breadth. We're not trying to serve as many students as humanly possible, and that's why we are deploying our resources in this way. All of those are resources that could have gone to launching more programs. We could have had more kids in our program, but we chose not to, and that's one of the things that we hope, distinguishes us. That's not it's
Yep.
not that there are not other organizations that do that, but it's that's part of our identity here. So,
Absolutely.
um, yeah, I'd love to start by looking at one of these tools, and I'll bring it up in a second. But it kind of hits on what I was just saying, which is we have a lot of inputs, and you hinted on some of Jenny having to create a lot of these tools. Even something like a Hello Insight, which is a very comprehensive tool that many sports-based youth development organizations use that assesses social emotional learning.
Yep.
It's very comprehensive, and even like lots of people get that. Lots of funders give it to their grantees and say, okay, it's part of our grant. We want you to use this. And in my experience, to use it and to use it well requires like a lot of muscle, like a lot of intellectual muscle and management muscle. If I just handed that to every program director and said, here's your report, I don't think it would change much of what we do. But really taking the time and having the expertise to read through the information that it spits back at you and say, okay, what does this mean? And how can we use it? And what is the top theme that I'm seeing? And how is this different across programs? So even when you do have a ready-made tool,
Yep.
implementing the tool still requires resources,
Right.
And I think the funding community it's hard to appreciate what's required to really build what I call sort of like data infrastructure effectively until you're really in it. It's like, great, you got this tool, just send out the survey, have the kids do it, and then it's like, then you're good to go. And it's like, not exactly. We probably won't get as much out of the tool as we want if we're doing that.
Or
So,
even get kids to fill it out if that's all you're doing.
yeah,
Right? There are
yeah.
so many steps along the way that require human resources.
Yeah, it's very easy to build kind of like a Frankenstein approach to data too. When you say, okay, get the kids to fill out the survey, we're like, okay, well, we want to do this survey, we want the pacer test, we got to collect grades, we got to collect attendance. And so you're just adding things on, and you're like, well, this is actually disrupting our programming. Like the number of hours that we have to influence kids or the timing that we do it, are we doing this at a time that the data people say, great, get a baseline before they've ever done one day of programming? You're like, well, I want them to actually like engage in the programming, decide they want to come back before I stick a survey in their face, because shocking, not all kids, if you show up on the first day, you're like, guys, guess what we're going to do? We're going to fill out a survey on this piece of paper or on your phone. Please come back tomorrow. That's not what they signed up for when they come to Harlem Lacrosse. So being thoughtful about how you implement some of the data collection,
For sure.
and shout out to Mary, who I mentioned earlier, for, among many things, the creation of the Operations Olympics at Harlem Lacrosse, which is a competition that includes many things, including how quickly and effectively you collect data at times when it's required.
I love that.
That plays on some of the competitiveness that, as you might imagine, some of our employees have embedded.
Some of your
Yeah.
yeah.
So. Yeah, so I'd love to bring up this tool. This is a tool that we've called the end of the year data analysis. And it's really the way I would describe it. I'll let Jenny describe it more, but it's kind of like taking all the data inputs. We collect data from a number of different sources. I've referenced a couple of them, sort of analyze it in a comprehensive way, and then try to draw conclusions on the individual program level so that the managers of those programs get information saying, okay, we looked at all the numbers and all the different surveys, and this is what we're seeing. This is what we see as a top priority for you moving forward. And yeah, I'm going to share my screen and bring it up. And then I'd love to have Jenny just kind of like talk a little bit about, how this document came to be and how you use it. How you and your team are using it.
Yeah, so in the glows and grows, there's two of each that we were looking to find for each manager, but in the drop down, there's 11 choices. So those are the 11 different inputs of data that we have that we're looking at, which is a ton. So a manager averages 8 program directors that they're giving feedback to with 11 different sources of input. That was a lot. So we wanted to give them a much more streamlined focus of this is where we want you to really hone your feedback on, both with things that they're doing really well and things that they need to work on. And so we created this by looking at all the sources of data, myself and our National Director of Programs, Claudia. And we did it separately, which was a really important step of this. We wanted to make sure that rather than dividing and conquering, we each went through this with all 40 program directors and then compared our notes to see where were we seeing things the same, what did we miss, what do we actually think is the true priority for a program. So that was a really healthy gut check to see where was our alignment to make sure when we handed it to a manager, we had really dug into the data with a lot of depth. And then from here, we wanted to have this really streamlined glows for each program and grows. And the way that they'll then use this is at end of year reviews. This is what they focused on in conversations of things that worked really well, things that didn't, and then helping to have that inform program design for the following year. So it also helped pop out some priorities. A lot of our programs had roster management as a grow. So making sure that that was an upcoming priority for this year and something that we've done a lot of training on and making sure that we're monitoring our roster management a lot more closely going into this upcoming year, since that was a more broad scale grow. But then using it at the more micro level. So our first four, this is a fun example. This is all in the same school building. And one of these program directors had GPA as a massive grow. They went from 66% improvement from kids that were failing the previous year, and that growth is just absolutely outstanding. And so what they did that was working in that building is partnership then that we can foster with their two peers that had GPA as a grow. And so making sure that that school building was working a lot more collaboratively to moving the needle for all the kids in that building with GPA was a really clear action item for this region to make sure that what was working with that one program director, we need all 4 coaches in that building doing that same work around GPA so that we can make sure that we see that growth across the board. And that was a lot of the examples that came out of managers were things like, you have this program director in your region that's excelling. Let's make sure that they're getting paired up with this other peer. Maybe it's across a region, maybe it's in their region, but someone else is doing this work really well. So let's start pairing people up to learn from each other of things that aren't working and things that we can be learning from. Um, so that is.
Can you describe for a second, like what you mean by roster management? Because I think we mean that in a specific way at Harlem Lacrosse that it's not necessarily just like how many kids are on your team.
Yeah, so roster management for us means do we have consistent groups of kids in every grade band that are engaging consistently? And so for most of our regions that most of our programs that have roster management as a grow, that might look like they had 16 eighth graders, 2 seventh graders, and 6 sixth graders. And ultimately, that's going to create some issues with our capacity when they get into ninth grade. And all of a sudden, they had 16 eighth graders graduate, and now there are not many captains returning into that next eighth grade cohort. That's going to be a culture challenge for that middle school program. It's also going to create some capacity issues when those eighth graders turn into ninth graders, and we have a huge ninth grade cohort that's transitioning all at once. And then eventually, when they become seniors. So we want to make sure that our college pathing team has a consistent number of seniors that are coming through so that we have the capacity to support them year after year rather than having ebbs and flows of the number of kids in each different cohort.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the tools that we've developed, there's kind of a consistent theme of like helping the direct service staff and the people who manage the direct service staff, like have an eye on uh, consistency and engagement across the board. You know, like it's very easy to, if you have a strong cohort, to sort of orient your programming to that cohort in that particular grade, and it's sort of like it creates gaps in the pipeline later because you're like, oh, all the practices are sort of oriented for these kids who are already good. Because they have this great core group of older kids who are good, and therefore not as many sixth graders are like, matriculating effectively and becoming engaged. just like you see that with hours of distribution, like, you're programming a lot for the kids who are at the highest end of your engagement at the expense of kids who are low. You need to have your eye on these kids. Same with GPA. Okay, like you have these great study halls for kids who are coming to all your study halls. You need to have your eye on these kids who are starting to slip. So that to me is a lot of the theme of some of these analysis. It's kind of like help the staff kind of keep their eye on the big picture because it's really hard when you're in the day to day. And like we may or may not get into all the different tools, all the 11 inputs that you reference, but they are, intentional. Like wall balls, like, we're not here to make kids great at lacrosse. That's not the objective of Harlem Lacrosse, but skill competency is really important for lots of things. And Megan can talk in great eloquence and depth about why that's important. And we also consider it very important for retention. Like kids don't have to be good, but they have to know that they are getting better. And that is one of the things that's going to keep them coming back for a long time. And you are going to get the maximum impact from Harlem Lacrosse if you are engaged over the course of many years. Like it's designed to work that way. So wall ball is something, even something like Pacer, it helps us understand if like our practices are active enough. And there's lots of academic tools and GPA, school attendance, program attendance. So there's lots of dimensions that we look at, and this kind of helped us boil it down for our team. So Megan, I'm curious. You've looked at this a little bit. We've shared it, gave you a full 1 day notice. But I know you've talked to Jenny a bunch over the years, and I'm curious what kind of stands out for you in this as we talk about, Harlem and the field and what's interesting to you about this kind of stuff.
Well, again, I think it speaks to the intention required to do this well, right? Like 11 data points is a lot. You are managing a lot of data in order to support the program model that you have invested in. And there's sort of like a lot of levels to that. I think the part of that is really understanding your program model, right? Really understanding what helps drive retention, for example, really understanding what the roster management is such a great example of one that is both really specific to your model, right? You want to have consistent numbers for lots of reasons, but I imagine that some of them are just your own capacity, right? There's just, everything's going to flow better if we keep the right number of kids in the program. But also it can be an indicator of retention. It can be an indicator of what's going right in a building, like you said. So I think but that requires you to understand what happens if you have too many kids in 12th grade or too few kids in 12th grade, right? Like it requires a reflection and a curiosity about why you're doing what you're doing in order to set up the questions you want answers to, right? And I think that is part of what's different about building a system like this. And like you said, Mike, earlier, saying, oh, these are two surveys or metrics that someone else will be interested in if I tell them we have better GPA or better Pacer scores, or, some funder wants me to be able to tell them that about the increase in GPA for all the kids in our program, or the higher Pacer, better Pacer scores. So you have those, but you also have these questions you're asking about what sort of enables those. What do you need to know in order to actually influence something like GPA? And I think that's a gap for a lot of our programs, right? It's sort of like we're doing sport. We know sport can be good. We know that young people are, we sort of anecdotally know that young people are getting something positive out of it. But then we jump from that assumption all the way to like the long-term end of the line outcome, and don't think about all the steps it takes to get there. and don't think about how you feed data into those places to make sure you're setting yourself up to get the long-term outcome that you want.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things that definitely informed, having been around a little bit, seen some different program models, like when I came to Harlem Lacrosse, like the long-term piece was always kind of like I have this bias towards it that I'm like, basically, you're not getting the full intervention if you don't stay with the program for a long time.
Totally.
And it's really hard to do that. And
Yeah.
there's not that many organizations that are sort of like built to accommodate that because it's really expensive and really hard, and there's school choice and sports get more competitive. So there's lots of reasons why kids won't retain. And it's just, it's a bigger hurdle, but in my opinion, that's when you can really sort of like capture the maximum impact that there is to capture. And so I would say that like the most important kind of like from our funders' perspective, and I think this is appropriate, like this is what I would share with them, like the academic metrics that you should care about the most are like long-term academic achievement. Our kids graduating high school, matriculating in college, persisting in college, and graduating college at rates that are better than the peers in their schools.
Mhm.
But it's like, there's no direct line with like, okay, well, we just like have lacrosse and then that happens. It's sort of like, well,
Right.
how are you influencing that? And I think we try to say, well, we're promoting strong academic behaviors. Are you coming to school? Are you behaving in class? Are you doing your homework? And that gets into like this feedback loop for the program team. It's like we found that we were driving more impact by coaching academic behaviors than by providing content area support. For us to be math tutors and English tutors and science tutors for 6 different grades, because we're serving kids in all those ways, is like, and for the kinds of staff that we're hiring, we're not likely to be able to move the needle in that way. And there's lots of other good resources there, but we can really move the needle in terms of coaching behaviors. That's a lot closer to what happens on the field.
Yep.
So you're like, okay, like you're struggling. And I know you're not coming to school a lot, or you're having a hard time focusing in this class, or you're having a hard time getting your work done. Those are the kinds of things that I think we can drive. So if you're like, yeah, care about the long-term outcomes, but like the things that we're paying attention to along the way may
Right.
not be the things that come to top of mind. Like we're trying to use this information to learn and be smarter about how we program.
I think a lot of programs are being asked to show the kind of long-term academic outcomes that you all are showing. And there's two ways to go about that. One is that we should not expect that of elementary and middle school programs, right? Like, or we should be like Harlem Lacrosse and think about what that path really looks like. If we are going to be held to that, if we do care about that, if that is the impact we want to have, then we can't just run 6th grade programs, right? We have to run programs that continue to support kids throughout that journey and figure out what that path looks like in order to do that. And I think the challenge in the funding community is expecting programs whose model is not the Harlem Lacrosse model to be able to do that, to be able to account for that when they haven't, when that's not what they do, or they have to give them the resources to actually build a program that does it.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, almost no funder that we have is giving money on a time horizon that matches the outcome. So you're like, okay, if the intervention starts in 6th grade and ends in 12th grade, are you funding on a 6-year cycle?
Right.
Because then we'll tell you what the outcomes are in 6 years. Like that's
Exactly.
really the way you should think about it. Like, we'll
Yep.
know this hasn't worked in 6 years. And there's lots of ways that we try to tell if it's working along the way.
Of course.
But the way that I sometimes describe it, I'm like, well, if you're trying to solve like a real problem, like something that has real depth and complexity to it, the idea that like, hey, we get one grant, even if it's a large grant, if we
Yep.
deploy that in one year and then the problem's solved, it's like that's probably not the right problem, or we're not probably being intellectually honest about the way in which we're solving it.
That's right.
Like real problems take time and resources to solve. The kinds of problems that we are solving, and it's I wrote a blog post a while back about a kind of what I consider to be like a failed college access intervention. And I think one of the challenges in the funding community is like the for-profit sector is really good at like developing tools, especially software tools, and scaling them very quickly. So like, if you talk to like a venture investor, they're like, okay, this will be a success if if they grow revenue like 1,000% in 3 years. And there's lots of companies that can do that, but that's like the business is sort of built to solve problems in that way. But but the kinds of problems that we are solving, okay, there's generations of poverty, a school system that is not delivering for its students. You have failing housing solutions, failing healthcare, immigration, all kinds of like really complex problems layer right on top of each other. And there's a kid sitting there, and you're like, okay, we're going to help that kid. It's not going to get solved in a year, you know. So that's why we have the model that we do. But I think it's a great point that you make. Is like funders have to sort of like reckon with that a little bit and be like, hey, either we want to fund in this way, depth over a long period of time, or we want to have different expectations, which are both really valuable. If you're like, hey, what do we want to see for the sixth graders? We should expect them to say, okay, they all have jobs, because that's going to take a long time and they're probably not built to track them until they're 25, you know?
Yeah.
So we should say, what are the behaviors we want to see in 1 year?
Yeah.
And when what's reasonable given our funding. So cool. Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff to study. I think we sometimes find ourselves in a little bit of a unique spot in talking to the funders. Like you said, it's like we shouldn't really expect other organizations. We do have some, I think, near peers or exact peers,
Mhm.
but we shouldn't expect everybody to do this. But that means sometimes the funders aren't really thinking about it in the same way that we are.
Totally.
And I'm sure it's true for the rest of the field as well, where like you don't really want lots of orgs being compared to Harlem Lacrosse if they're not set up to do so. And we don't really want to be compared to lots of other orgs if we think that we're tackling the problem in a different way or a different set of problems.
Right. You
Um,
don't want somebody asking you to grow numbers,
right,
which some
right.
funders, that's what they care about, right? And
Yeah.
so,
And there is value in that. I never want to sort of
no, it's
undervalue
just
serving
not
lots
your
of
model.
kids. Yeah. We talk about growth in different ways. Like we'll
Yeah.
look at the average hours of participation per student
Totally.
as growth, or the number of seniors who are graduating, which is like indicative of our retention numbers. So you're like,
Right.
okay, we increase our retention by 5%, and you have sort of what I call the lifetime retention rate for a cohort. Of all the kids who ever entered this cohort, how many remain active as seniors in high school?
Right.
Like taking that from 30% to 40% is growth, and there are ways that we can deploy resources aimed specifically at that. That is much different than us launching a new program. And there's sort of pluses and minuses to if we launch a new program, it puts stress on lots of systems in the organization and management structure and people, like just like our ability to do that. So sometimes you feel like, well, if we really want to have 10% more impact, not 10% more students, but 10% more impact on the world, we might be smarter aiming this money at increasing our retention than adding 10% programs. We think we'll have a better chance at success at doing that.
Yeah.
So cool. Well, there's another tool that I wanted to share, which is really exciting that has kind of been percolating in my brain for a long time. It really was, you really put this idea in my head when you were sharing some work that Soccer Without Borders was doing a while back, and Jenny and I have been kind of kicking it around. But this tool is what we're calling the program look fors. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about this tool is like, I think it gets away from the data collection in kind of like a discrete format. Like, okay, we collect data at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, and there's this
Right.
judgment associated with it. And this is something a little bit different. This is like
Yeah.
we're collecting information to inform our practice, but this is not a report card. There's no one is getting graded here. We're just using information to try and be smarter, and that's kind of attractive to me. So I'll bring it up, but Jenny, if you want to just describe a little bit about kind of how you developed the program Look Fors and the ways in which you're using it now.
So the program Look Fors, they were developed between like what we've been using for a lot of years of what every great drill has and what every great practice has, and try to make them a little bit less lacrosse specific so that it can work for study hall activities, enrichment activities. But The idea is that it's a list of 15 things that every great day of programming has. And off the jump, there's an option for not today, because not all 15 are going to happen on every given day. That would be very unlikely, and that's not the goal. The goal is not to get a 15 out of 15. The goal is that this is a tool to foster feedback communication between a manager and a program director so that they have common language to describe what happened at practice, what worked, what can be better. And it's also a tool for our managers to be making sure that we're consistent with the feedback that we're delivering. It's not in exact order, but they go kind of in order of the earlier skills that we teach our program directors, building up to more robust skills that our more senior and tenured program directors are using in their toolkit. But we try to think about all these as like, these are things in our toolkit. So if we can get better at 1 or 2 a year, our program delivery is going to be higher quality over years to come. So the way that we use it in 2 ways. We use it after each day of programming that a manager attends for a visit. The manager fills it out and the program director fills it out. And then we also use it for video cycles that we do with all of our managers to work on being consistent with the use of this tool across our regions, because that's a really important piece too. We want to make sure that a manager in one of our regions isn't viewing this in a very different way than a manager in another one of our regions. So that consistency piece, we do a lot of work with videos as well with our managers.
I'm looking at this and I see Megan's kind of like fingerprints all over it. I hope it's cool to see, something like this is like you referenced before we started recording like 20 years ago, you were like, you weren't there. I'm like, I started working at Metro Lacrosse in November of 2007. So I'm almost to my 20 years.
18 years.
Yeah. But it's like, but I have deep respect for people who have been in this for a long time. You at the top of that list, but like some of these concepts, like I just can hear conversations that we had many years ago.
Yeah.
And I hope those ideas are working their way into the Harlem Lacrosse programming. So I'm curious what you think of when you see a tool like this and at Harlem Lacrosse, and how you see other stuff like this in the field.
Well, first, I was just saying you weren't there 18 years ago because I'm just older, and I was giving you an out to have not been there 20 years ago. 18 is basically the same. And of course, major shouts to Mary Connor and her time at Soccer Without Borders, now at Common Goal, and like a lot of early work thinking about how do you just get some data every day and do something with it. How do you build a system that actually helps give coaches feedback? Because I think that's one thing that we under value in the space is we sort of think like, if we've gotten a coach to do this work, then like we've done what we needed to do, right? Like we got them in, and maybe we trained them at the beginning. We sort of like gave them a great send off. They got all the tools they needed on the front end. And then we're like, I hope everything goes okay. And to your point about sort of data that you get pre-season and post-season, maybe we're doing that, but we're not doing anything to help sort of coach them through getting better. And so in the same way that we want to be really specific about what we want to see kids get better at, we want to be really specific about what we want to see coaches get better at. And I think we have this like assumption that coaches don't want that feedback. And I think that's just like wildly untrue. Like everybody wants to know what to do to get better. And if you can present it in a way, like you said, Jenny, the goal is not 15 out of 15. If we can get better in 2 of these, like like that's really amazing. And I think that part of this work, I actually think is like the most, has the most impact, right? Like if you can change the skills of coaches in these areas, if you can turn more novice coaches into more expert coaches and sort of shorten the amount of time it takes to do that, shorten the cycle it takes for coaches to like exhibit some of those really higher level skills, that's like the biggest lever for getting the kind of outcomes you want. It's the biggest lever for retention. It's the biggest lever for kids experience. It's the biggest lever for seeing change in the young people. And so, and it takes an enormous amount of time and energy and resource to do it well, because the other part of what you're talking about there, Jenny, is like controlling for fidelity, right? Like you can have a great tool and people can be using it in wildly different ways, but that won't have the same kind of impact as everybody watching the same video and seeing if you agree on what somebody's doing well or not doing well. And I imagine in the early days, and or when you change managers, or even sometimes randomly, you'll be like, oh wow, like we see this totally differently. And seeing things totally differently isn't bad. It's just data. Just the same way you said, data is telling us a story. That's telling a story, and it is a story that has a direct impact on the quality of the program.
Yeah, there's a couple things you said that really resonated with me. One is sort of like the coach's learning orientation. I think there it is. If you think about the way that we view sort of pro sports, consume pro sports, and you're like, okay, it's very dictatorial. It's like I'm expected to have all the answers as a coach, or I will get fired. And sort of there's good coaches and bad coaches, and so I think there are reasons in the culture where we might have that bias. Whereas like definitely the best coaches, in one of our core values is being a learning organization. Like when we hire you, we're assessing whether we think you can be coached. That's one of the biggest skills that we want you to have. So we want you to have not the orientation of like, I'm a great coach, I have all the answers, don't tell me what to do. But like, I'm thirsting for the opportunity to study my practice and to get better. And something like scaffolding, or, any of the dimensions of that document, you're like, okay, there's lots of ways that can be applied. The idea that like, okay, the skill is not every kid is ready for the skill, so I need to like invent tools that will that I can then take away later that will be scaffold, so they can develop the skill over time. You're like, I think of a classic Harlem Lacrosse drill where it's like a shooting drill, and some kids are receiving a pass and shooting, and some kids are starting with the ball already in their stick. Okay, and then eventually you just take it away, and you're like, how to apply scaffolding and think creatively about how everything can be scaffolded is like, you know, it's not like you see the PowerPoint and you're like, there, I got it. It's like
Right.
there's an infinite number of ways that can be applied. And if we think creatively, and that's kind of like how we want our people thinking. And it's been kind of interesting for me because I've been coaching my own kids who are much younger than the Harlem Lacrosse students who are playing sports that are not lacrosse, and some sports that I have no experience in. And so I'm like trying to apply these principles in like, I'm about to start a season of 5-year-old basketball.
Mhm.
And so I've been thinking a lot about scaffolding, and I think a lot about time transitions and reps, and basically like,
Yeah.
to me, the most important factors for me with that group is like joy and repetition. So how can I minimize the amount of time that I'm talking? How can I have the most number of balls going? And so that every kid is doing an activity for most of the time, and they are smiling and moving
Yep.
and coming back, you know? So like I'm going to prioritize those things over like, a lot of technical instruction, like, and hopefully it works, but I'm sure I'll run into problems. And after the first practice, I'll be like, I'm not doing anything. And I'll probably call Jenny and be like, this is what happened. Help me think about how to do this better. And that's kind of what we're going for. But Jenny, I'd love for you to share like how you're using it, because actually one of the other things that informed this concept at Harlem Lacrosse is I was visiting a school in Baltimore, with a really strong school leader. And I was in the teachers' lounge in between meetings, and a bunch of teachers were evaluating a student writing and the teacher feedback to the writing. So they were all sitting there being like, okay, here's the writing sample, here's the feedback that the teacher gave. Let's sort of dissect, is this the right feedback? How can it be improved? And I would love the rigor and collaboration and sort of the learning orientation of the group. And I was like, oh man, if we can get a little bit of this, I think we can be better practitioners. So I would love for you to share, Jenny, the kind of recent example that we talked about of like how you were using this tool.
Yeah, so I worked at that school. So
Mm.
I love the feedback on feedback. So that's one of the main
Mm.
ways we use this tool. Is our managers, we will give each other feedback on feedback, and we will practice giving feedback to the same set of video that we'll watch together, and make sure that we're seeing things the same way. And then really paying attention to at the end of this form, there's a section where you can make comments, and that's where our managers write out the feedback that they would deliver to that program director. And that's where we spend a lot of time in really refining how do we say the feedback that we need to deliver in a way that it's going to be received, and use tools. We've learned how to really integrate ChatGPT and making sure we're delivering the best feedback possible. And so that's a really important way that we're using it. We're also using it to inform our training. So we had probably about 100 feedback forms were completed by mid-fall. And when we went to do our lacrosse professional development session, I thought it was going to be on scaffolding. It usually is. And one of the most common areas that we needed to grow in was tempo. And so we did a session on how are we improving our tempo at practice. Use some video clips, use some practice planning, just a couple like tips and tricks, things like roll the ball out for the next rep to make sure that you're not waiting for kids to clear out. If the next rep is starting, kids naturally will. And then having our manager use things like timers between reps to help PDs see like you are getting explicitly better at your tempo. So making sure that, we're continuously looking at data to inform our training. And that absolutely had an impact on the professional development we did this fall after having a couple cycles of these.
I love that.
Yeah, it's we've done trainings with the center, and directly and indirectly, like in a way, all of our training is influenced by your work. But it's another thing that I hope differentiates us and is unique about the model is sort of like the nature of having our direct service staff be full-time employees is not every organization operates that way. And so our approach to professional development, when Jenny references like our lacrosse professional development, is like we've got a bunch of tools that are ongoing, like structures built in, monthly meetings, more than monthly meetings, opt-in meetings, required meetings that are like we have an opportunity to address some of these issues on an ongoing basis. We're not trying to have everybody come to the training at the beginning of the season and then say, good luck. But a lot of organizations are in that position. If you like run a little league or something, that's basically what you do. So
If you do a training at the beginning of the season, but
yeah, yeah. I had an amazing experience. I thought of you, and I was watching a little league game in my community. Not my kids. I like going to youth sports events of like my community just for fun. But they have a great like umpire training program for kids. So they have like a teenager was serving as the umpire for this game that was like 7 and 8 year olds,
yeah.
and this guy got really out of hand, like a coach. And in my opinion, he got out of hand. And he was like yelling at this kid. And I was like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. And there was like a supervisor there because when the teenager is umpiring the game, they have a supervisor. And he really like let the kid. I was like, God, you got to intervene here. But then he like broke it down afterwards, talked to the dad, and I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting concept. I think they're doing it because they need more people to umpire, but I was like, what a great experience for the kid to learn, the teenager.
Totally.
Hopefully not in that circumstance if with parents that get unruly, but
Yeah.
with the right supports, it's not bad. So yeah, anyways, we've gone a little ways here and I really appreciate both the work that you're doing. I think it's there's some really smart things happening in the world of youth sports. I hope a lot of those things are happening at Harlem Lacrosse, but I know they're happening elsewhere as well. And it's you mentioned earlier, it's like there's so much that is broken, and there is a lot that's broken, but it also remains just like the most beautiful thing to me. I think there is really amazing things happening in youth sports all over the place, and the more that we can all put our heads together to try to figure it out, I think we can push back against some of the forces at play. And I really appreciate the systems work that you are doing at your organization, because that's the kind of work that we are not doing. But we butt up against it all the time. And I cringe every time I read a headline about private equity investment in youth sports. And we have many private equity investors who are donors, and I respect the industry, but I believe very strongly that's not going to lead to good outcomes. The privatization of youth sports is not what we want in this country. And the free market is pushing us in that direction, and there has to be some forces pushing back.
That's right.
And you are one of them, and I hope we are too. And just really appreciate the work that you're doing and your perspective on what we're doing at Harlem.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to be able to hold up the places where it's working really well so that programs can be driving towards that. And funders can feel like their investment is accomplishing the goals that they want to see. I think sport is dramatically under-resourced from a philanthropy perspective. And if the philanthropy space doesn't step up, we will lose to private equity. We will only the goals and the sort of outcomes of what youth sport exists for will not be the goals and outcomes of what Harlem Lacrosse exists for.
Yeah, it's true. Well, we're fighting the fight, and I know you are as well. And because of our collaboration, hopefully we're doing a little bit smarter, and a little bit more effective. We certainly need all the brain power we can
You
get
guys
behind
got
the
a lot of
stick.
brains. That's you're not short on brains at Harlem Lacrosse, that's for sure.
Well, we're trying.
Yeah.
But there are times when we are, I know I feel that way in my own job. There are times that I'm like, oh man, I really, I'm in the major leagues now, got to step up. But yeah, and I just want to underscore also just the respect and admiration I have for the long haul to both of you. This stuff is not that easy, and there is a small number of people that have been as committed as you all for the length of time, and there are many, many, many young people who have benefited because of it. So keep on, keeping on.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah,
Always good to talk to you all.
yeah, you too.
All right.
Thanks for tuning in to Mondays with Mike, Game Changers in Lacrosse. We release new episodes on all major streaming platforms and the Harlem Lacrosse YouTube channel. To learn more about our transformative model and impact, visit harlemlacrosse.org.